In this lecture, we will discuss about a burning issue that is related to error, or we can say discrepancies. This video titled Tender Errors, Legal Recourse and FIDIC Red and Yellow Book Perspectives will discuss in detail, which will give you a more comprehensive understanding on the topic. So let us begin with the topic. Errors in tender submissions can significantly impact construction contracts. Whether it's a simple arithmetic error or a major omission, tender errors can lead to financial and operational consequences for both contractors and employers. The question we're exploring is, can a contractor seek redress if a tender containing an error is accepted, particularly under FIDIC contracts? To answer this, we will first discuss the legal principles of tender errors and then examine how FIDIC's red and yellow books deal with such situations in design bid build and design build projects. Part 1. Legal principles on tender errors and redress. A tender submission is a formal offer made by a contractor to carry out specific works for a stated price. Once the client or employer unconditionally accepts this tender, a binding contract is created. But what happens when the tender contains an error? Can the contractor adjust their offer post-acceptance, or are they bound by the error? General rule: errors cannot be corrected after acceptance. In contract law, the general rule is straightforward. Once a tender is accepted, any errors in the tender become part of the contract, and the tenderer is bound by them. This means that any pricing errors, omissions, or incorrect quantities are the tenderer's responsibility, and they will bear the consequences, even if this results in a financial loss. For example, if a contractor submits a bid with an error in the price or scope of works, and the client unconditionally accepts it, the contractor cannot subsequently claim that the error should be corrected. They must adhere to the terms of the accepted tender. Exception: client knowledge of the error. There is a notable exception to this rule. If the client is aware of the error and proceeds to accept the tender without raising the issue, the contractor may have grounds for redress. Courts have ruled that if a client knowingly accepts a tender containing an error without acting in good faith or bringing the mistake to light, this may be considered sharp practice. In such cases, the court may intervene to rectify the contract, eliminating the error and ensuring fairness. Case example: Traditional Structures Limited versus HW Construction Limited in 2009. In this case, Traditional Structures Limited submitted a tender for steelwork and roof cladding. Due to an error, the tender only included the price for the steelwork, omitting the roof cladding cost. The client, HW Construction, was aware of this error but did not raise it. When the contractor later sought payment for the roof cladding, the client refused, arguing that the price for both items had been included in the original tender. The court found in favor of the contractor, ruling that the client acted dishonestly by knowingly accepting the tender with an error. The court ordered that the contract be rectified to include the correct price for the roof cladding. This case highlights the importance of good faith and honesty in contract acceptance. Courts will not tolerate a party knowingly taking advantage of another's mistake. Unilateral mistakes. A unilateral mistake occurs when only one party is mistaken about a key term of the contract. Courts may intervene if the other party is aware of the mistake but fails to act reasonably or fairly. If the client deliberately accepts a tender with an error without notifying the contractor, They may be found guilty of sharp practice, and the contract could be rectified to reflect the correct terms. Part 2. FIDIC Contracts Red and Yellow Book Perspectives. FIDIC contracts, widely used in construction projects, provide a structured framework for the relationship between employers and contractors. The FIDIC Red Book, used for design bid-build contracts, and the FIDIC Yellow Book, used for design-build contracts, have specific provisions that address tender errors and contractor responsibilities. FIDIC Red Book, Design Bid-Build, where the owner defines the design and provides it to the bidders. The FIDIC Red Book applies to design bid-build projects, where the employer provides the design and the contractor is responsible for execution. In such contracts, the employer takes on the majority of the design risk, while the contractor's role is primarily to ensure construction adheres to the employer's design. However, the Red Book includes mechanisms for addressing errors or inconsistencies in the contract. 1. Clause 3.5 Determinations by the engineer. Under the Red Book, the engineer is empowered to make determinations when there are discrepancies or errors in the contract. For example, if an error is identified in the tender after acceptance, the engineer can resolve the issue by determining a fair adjustment to the contract price or scope. This ensures that the project continues without unnecessary delays due to disputes over errors. 2. Clause 1.5 Priority of Documents. The Red Book outlines the priority of documents to resolve any inconsistencies between tender documents and the contract. If there is a conflict between the tender and the contract, this clause helps clarify which terms govern the project, ensuring that the correct terms are applied to resolve disputes. However, despite these mechanisms, the general rule still applies. Once a tender is accepted, the contractor is bound by any errors they have made, unless they can prove the employer acted in bad faith. FIDIC Yellow Book. Design and Build. The FIDIC Yellow Book governs design-build contracts, where the contractor is responsible for both design and execution. In such contracts, the contractor bears greater risk as they are responsible for verifying the employer's requirements and ensuring that tender reflects the complete scope of work. Any errors in the tender are generally considered the contractor's responsibility. 1. Clause 5.1 General Design Obligations. Under this clause, the contractor is required to ensure that their design meets the employer's specifications. If the contractor submits a tender with an error related to the design, they cannot later claim additional time or cost to correct it. The contractor must conduct a thorough review of the employer's requirements during the tender stage to avoid such mistakes. 2. Clause 1.9 Errors in employer's requirements. The Yellow Book provides a mechanism for contractors to notify the employer if they discover an error in the employer's requirements. However, this must be done early in the project. If the contractor fails to raise the issue promptly, they are responsible for any additional costs or delays resulting from the error. This clause places the burden of identifying and correcting errors on the contractor, as they are in control of both the design and construction. 3. Fitness for purpose versus reasonable skill and care. The Yellow Book often includes a fitness for purpose obligation, requiring the contractor to guarantee that the works will meet their intended function. This is a higher standard than the reasonable skill and care requirement found in some other contracts. If the works do not meet the fitness for purpose standard, the contractor can be held liable even if they complied with the employer's specifications. This makes it crucial for contractors to carefully assess the employer's requirements during the tendering process. case example, MT Hojgaard AS versus A.on. In this case, the contractor was held liable for defects in offshore wind turbine foundations, despite following the employer's design. The court ruled that the contractor had failed to meet the fitness for purpose obligation, illustrating how the Yellow Book places significant responsibility on contractors to ensure that the completed works function as intended. Another example, case example, SSE Generation Limited versus Hochtief Solutions AG in 2018. A notable FIDIC Yellow Book case is SSE Generation Limited versus Hochtief Solutions AG, involving the design and construction of a tunnel for a hydroelectric power station in Scotland. Hochtief, the contractor, was responsible for both designing and constructing the tunnel. The tunnel, which was built according to Hochtief's design, suffered a major collapse due to unforeseen ground conditions, which were not adequately addressed in the design. SE Generation Limited, the employer, claimed that the contractor was liable because the tunnel failed to meet its intended function, despite the design being carried out to the specified industry standards. The court found in favor of SSE, ruling that Hochtief had a fitness for purpose obligation under the FIDIC Yellow Book contract. This meant that even though the contractor followed acceptable design standards, they were still responsible for ensuring that the completed works were fit for the intended purpose of the project, namely that the tunnel was safe and functional. The court held that the contractor was liable for the failure because the contract specifically required the works to be fit for purpose. This decision reinforced the principle that in design and build contracts, contractors under the Yellow Book bear responsibility for the outcome of their works, not just adherence to standards. Summary: tender errors in FIDIC contracts. In summary, tender errors can lead to serious consequences for contractors, and their ability to correct such errors depends largely on the contractual framework in place. Under traditional contract law, once a tender is accepted, the contractor is bound by its terms, including any mistakes. However, if the client knowingly accepts a tender containing an error, courts may intervene to rectify the contract. The FIDIC Red Book allows more flexibility through the engineer's determinations. But once the tender is accepted, the contractor generally bears the responsibility for any errors. In the FIDIC Yellow Book, the contractor takes on a much greater level of risk, as they are responsible for both design and construction. The contractor must carefully review the employer's requirements during the tender phase to avoid errors, as claims for rectifying errors after acceptance are limited. Both FIDIC frameworks emphasize the importance of fair dealing and good faith between the parties, but they place a heavy burden on contractors to ensure the accuracy and completeness of their tender submissions.